Welcome everyone to a new lecture of Psychology of Consciousness. Today we will talk about the triple S model, self, soul, and spirit. This is one of my contributions to this field that I want to discuss in this week and the next one, because those are two parts of the same discussion. Next week, we will examine to some extent as a summary, the quote unquote solution or a solution to the mind-body problem. And rather than discussing what a neuroscientist or a psychologist ought to embrace in discussing consciousness, these two parts of the discussion should foster new ways to look at the very problem of consciousness, so that the discussion is not reaching an endpoint, but hopefully will open up new doors to better understand what makes us human. So in this model, self, soul, and spirit, an acronym that I often utilize in my lectures, in my publications, I am doing my best to orient the conversation to include all the previously discussed perspectives and models of consciousness. Now, this, of course, has to do both with a straightforward philosophical, theoretical assumption and examination, but also a practical application of psychology of consciousness, because after all, this is a psychology course. So without further ado, let's begin the conversation.
Listing the following models, methods to better understand the mind-body connection, we could begin with the scientific method, which is the evidence-based, the observational, empirical. We mentioned that in regard to modernism, to positivism, and to postmodernism, and the Age of Enlightenment, and the golden rule, so to speak, of double-blind, case control, randomized trials, the principle of falsifiability, the hierarchy of evidence. And then the second one would be the philosophical model and method, since the focus of this chapter is philosophy as basic approach toward neuroscience. And we mentioned this multiple times in the context of natural philosophy, that this overall understanding of the field underlying science. So philosophical model and methods, each of which depends on multiple positions, and we will see whether we should embrace or not a how can I define this? A relativist perspective. And then third, the artistic model and method, which is something that might be surprising to some of you in a course on neuroscience, including theories of perceptions to art movements and philosophies, to the sheer enjoyment through the senses. So the importance of understanding through our own perspective, our pleasure even. We'll talk about that in the second part of this chapter, as well as artistic model and method to the social, political, the sense or meaning making, the affirming, affirmative, activating, and even activist component of performance art. We talked about this especially in connection to society and the understanding of current issues. The fourth one will be actually the spiritual, meditative, transcendental, religious model and method. This again with special reference to mystical experiences, but also NDEs, OOBEs, alternate state of consciousness, neurotheology, etc. This is fundamental because we're talking about mind-body connection. So when we will discuss the difference or similarity between mind, body, spirit, and soul, this will be a very important perspective to take into account. We can relate to John Gray's view on contemporary science in relation to Kurzweil's singularity, which in modern times resembles what magic was for ancient civilization. So provided a general sense of hope toward the achievement of eternal life. Now, since we mentioned Hegel, think of this perspective. So according to the German philosopher, the absolute knowledge presents itself, though not in a conceptual form proper of the German concept of Begriff, the concept, right? But in a pictorial form, okay? So imagine this imaginative, figurative, transcendental form as described by the Vorstellung. This will be the term that Hegel uses, this representation. Okay, so it's a poetic, imaginative, creative expression, almost idiomatic, to represent oneself, to imagine a possible future outcome, the Stell dir vor. It's a pictorial form which is essential to understand why we are arguing that philosophy can be a basic approach toward neuroscience. It is not contrary to the scientific method. It's not contrary to the scientific basis of laboratory science, but it's something that goes beyond that. The appropriate philosophical methodology should thus follow a formal dialectical process, keep in mind Hegelian dialectics, but should engage in an introspective rememorization, recollection. We talked about introspection last week, and this is connection to memory, recollection, and Erinnerung, which will be the original term, this speculative philosophy. Think about Giambattista Vico, for instance. Now, there could be a criticism to this, because one might argue, why adding this philosophical, transcendental, even religious perspective to neuroscience? We should stick to empirical science, to evidence-based science, as if the former is opposite to the latter. Well, criticism to traditional religions often identify the perceived delusional, illusional aspect of belief and practice, as in, well, please, let's remove anything religious from the discussion on science, because, first of all, we don't have any way to prove it, beside maybe coercion, and this is really contrary to the ethics of science, and also you cannot force someone to believe in the absence of evidence, in spite of evidence, some of the atheist philosopher would suggest. Now, delusion, illusion associated with religion. Now, in this view, revealed religion is an illusion, because its truth is always something that has to be represented, non-conceptualized. Now, this is not necessarily a criticism, however, okay, because the view that we just mentioned in regard to Vico and Hegel says that the content of religion is correct, but the form is wrong. And so this is not something that is understood from a perspective of concept alone, okay? But it has to be represented. The representation, to a very big extent, it's a dramatic representation. It's a poetic representation. It's recreation. It's liturgical in nature. It's remanifesting in the present time something that is, by definition, outside of space and time. Now, this certainly defines the problematic relation between illusion, representation, perception, conceptualization, and revelation of metaphysical messages, and even the phenomenology of psychiatric events. We talked about this in regard to the criticism to this neuroscientistic approach that often Western psychiatry utilizes. Now, definition of manifestation or epiphany are very important in analyzing the cognitive rational perspective as preferred method of investigation of such issues. To provide an example here, a rationalization or cognitivation of the figure or the image of a divine being, or of the Spirit, the Holy Ghost even, would not make sense at all, according to this analysis, to Veran's interpretation of Hegel, because of the nature and substance of this spiritual entity. It does not even make sense to rationalize it, to use cognitive approaches, which are in the end what we use in science, in evidence-based science, to better understand that. To continue with our analysis here, we'll stick to Hegel. There is a term that he utilizes, the beautiful soul. And keep in mind what we said about this connection between beauty in an aesthetic sense, perceptual sense, which has to do again with our perception. If this perception is accurate, it's in the right place. You could say it's not sick, it's not disoriented, it's not disordered. This beauty is both, again, aesthetic as well as ethic. Okay? So the beautiful soul is both the very intuition of the divine as well as the divine intuition of itself. Keep in mind this phenomenal aspect of human beings, in the sense that separates them from other animals, this recognition of themselves as self, as thinking self, we could say, to push a bit the Cartesian understanding, the thing, therefore I am. So the divine intuition of itself, the self own acts in juxtaposition, contraposition to what was content, the content in a content sense of the religious perspective. Now, we could also mention, since we will talk about neurolinguistics, that this is the reason beyond the divine nature of language, which is something you can find throughout the ancient world, from our current alphabet, alpha and beta, to the abjad, to the runes, to the Egyptian hieroglyphs, to the pictograms, the hierograms, etc., etc., etc. Because the divine nature of language learned at the level of the meaning, das Meinen in German, because of its connection to poetry, and the fact that in the end it leads to philosophy, to a communion with itself. Last week we talked about the unio mystica, the mystical union, right? So the reason beyond the divine nature of language is learned at the level of meaning, since the real cannot be said, cannot be uttered. This is a phenomenal analogy. Now, one of the things that we also have to keep in mind is some of the cognitive, or rather biased cognitive scientific approaches to making science real nowadays, and this is connected to this progressive split into multiple subfields. Now, this course analyzes multiple subfields of neuroscience, but think about what happens in science in terms of dividing multiple subfields where the connection between these fields would be more important. Well, this has a direct impact on funding research studies. To think of one example, and for instance, application toward grants, right? So if the amount of money is limited, if you apply to private grants or to the NIH, for instance, and everyone wants the money, every researcher needs the money to perform research, well, one of the best ways to access these funds is exactly to further subdivide the fields of science, field of medicine, which in turn promotes the idea that it's actually better to know a lot more about a very limited area of investigation. Now, this is not necessarily a bad thing in itself. We mentioned this throughout this course, that nobody can be an expert in everything. But if this ultimately results into a lack of communication between fields, this turns into a lack of perception of the bigger picture, and it's only an economical factor, not a really scientific one. Because what does it mean to be an expert? Yet again, we mentioned this, an expert is someone who experiences, right? It's someone who has or makes an experience. So despite the fact that science has to account for the subjective experience in this context. Now, moving on to the central part of, or one of the central parts of this chapter, let's move to the triple S model, self, soul, and spirit. We will begin our voyage here by analyzing critical neuroscience, yet again, as a direct heir of epistemology and heuristics. Now, we mentioned this in the context of Aristotelian episteme, techne, and phronesis. So if the question is, in week 13 and 14, toward the end of this semester, what is psychology of consciousness? And how does psychology of consciousness relate to fields such as medicine, and even more importantly to neuroscience, and more specifically to critical neuroscience? The critical, critique, criticism, analysis of the connection between neural underpinnings of cognition, emotion, and action, so behavior, and our awareness, our perception, our consciousness. Well, critical neuroscience has the duty to investigate the fallacies such as deriving, please pay attention, a prescription for a pure description. Critical neuroscience, yet again, has the duty to investigate the fallacies such as deriving a prescription for a pure description, or in general, deriving prescription from pure description. This is a quote by Moore. And this, again, is a core concept of the course. One of the idea that I would like to bring to your attention is that science cannot and should not be separated from considerations that are usually connected to philosophy, ethics, and even spirituality, metaphysics, considerations around what should we do, what is the proper way to exist, how can we develop empathy, how can we develop love. Now, the link between pure description, okay, and what our mind and soul really are, or what our brain should do, is at the center of deriving prescription for pure description. This is the same problem we encounter in week 4 and 5. Just by observing things, we cannot necessarily infer what those things are in a deeper sense, what they should do. Now, this is not to say that, similar to what we seen in discussing Thomistic philosophy, that through the book of nature, so through the analysis of neuroanatomy, structure, function, fMRI, we could not find the book of God, so to speak, because if there is a God, if there is a divine presence in the world, well, it's fair to assume, and the reason why this is fair, it was already analyzed in previous weeks, that the language is the language of nature. Science and divine elements, scientific method and spirituality should not fight against one another because they come from the same source. That's the whole idea. But we cannot simply infer that our sheer observation and pure observation alone can tell us about this inner nature of things, the inner essence of things. And this is what brings us to the suggestion here, the triple S model that this chapter presents. The triple S indicates the initials of self, soul, and spirit, starting with an examination of the clinical context. What does it mean to apply neuroscience to better understand the mind-body connection in these 3 areas, to understand ourself, our soul, and our spirit? It's a tripartite component of our existential experience, and we mentioned this number 3 several times in this course. And some of the images that we'll present to you here as part of this video, some of them are included in the textbook, some instead are brand new, and you can only find it in this video, have to do with this element of 3 from a philosophical and even theological perspective. I will make sure to provide you with multiple examples from monotheistic sources as well as polytheistic sources, spirituality, philosophy, and religion in general. So imagine this 3 model, the tripartite component of our existential experience could be viewed in this way. So there are 3 ways to describe and define human experience. Experience as individual, an individual experience, or subjectively understood. Experience as transcendental or internally felt. And finally, experience as metaphysical or divinely inspired. Now, in the textbook, you'll see that it's always and or because of the needed clarity here. And this is because there are multiple ways to interpret that, but those 3 areas are the ones that we should always take into account to better understand the mind-body problem. Okay, so an individual experience, a transcendental experience, and a metaphysical experience, they have to do with the 3 elements. You could say they have to do with spirit, body, and mind. They have to do with self, soul, and spirit, and they have to do with understanding, thinking about cognition in a subjective sense. They have to be connected to feelings and emotions internally, right? And have to be connected to the divine breath, we could say. We mentioned this in week 2 and 3 regarding the élan vital or the bios, vis, the ruach in Semitic languages, Geist or ghost, and spiritus, right? Inspiration, the breath of life, the Atman, okay, the metaphysical, the element that goes beyond the physical. Now, how can we better understand this framework? Okay, because there are three elements. Okay, and we have to better define what self, soul, and spirits are. And I always suggest students to start with an etymological analysis. Sorry, got a little stuck there. What does it mean self? What does it mean soul? What does it mean spirit? And the framework that we use is critical by definition. Okay, we don't want to just push this idea, but it's critical in that it examines the first level of data collection from experimental studies in neuroscience. Okay, so you have to understand what the science tells us because you have solid scientific evidence in front of you. Data collection from experimental studies as the first level. The second level of scientific and philosophical interpretation, which in modernist times, in a positivistic sense, in materialistic sense, is really mechanical, process-based, as well as solidly mathematical, statistical, epidemiological. And the third level is actually the direct implication for the life lived. So I really want to stress this for students that might be to some extent intimidated by the depth of knowledge required to understand empirical sciences, hard sciences, on top of the complexity of our philosophical discussion throughout the course. The third element is you, is your experience, is the way you exist in the world, the way you feel the connection between your mind and your body. Just because you might not have an academic training quite yet, you could say, this does not nullify or invalidate the way you feel your body, as well as the way you feel about your body, the way you feel your soul, as well as the way you feel about your soul. In this regard, again, the connection and the importance of your heart, your being in the right place, having your heart in the right place, validating your experience. I want to mention what we discussed a few weeks ago regarding the contrast between liberal studies and STEM fields, and the fact that certain social sciences, think about psychology for instance, have been criticized for lack of scientific depth or application of a scientific method. And I want to mention a quote by Stefan Schleim that describes the possible outcomes of a moral discourse originating in a philosophical assumption deprived of philosophical understanding. Okay, because that's the idea. Very often, certain scientists assume that they know enough of philosophy, but the contrary is not necessarily true. That philosophers don't know enough about science, and philosophy here is to some extent stretched into including the social science perspective. So this is, this philosophical assumption deprived of philosophical understanding applies specifically to modern neuroscientific research. Quote by Schleim, generations of anthropologists and moral psychologists before had gathered evidence on the development, cognitive, emotional mechanisms, and cultural diversity of morality, but suddenly in 2001, with the publication of the first neuroimaging experiments, the situation seemed to have changed. It seems fair to say that of the 7 different psychological, neuroscientific, theoretical accounts of morality, distinguished by Horgmol et al., all the evidence gathered hitherto does not unequivocally favor any particular one. While the science communication accompanying the original study by Green et al. Suggested the philosophical relevance of the research, even putting forward the idea that the new finding could make moral philosophers superfluous, so far the opposite has been the case. Theoreticians of all kinds responded to the prescriptive normative claims and emphasized how these neuroscientific reports rely on theoretical presumptions and individual interpretation. While theoretical in its scope, moral neuroscience is used to provide the ultimate answers of human right and wrong that Sperry and Gazzaniga called for. More applied technical implications are promised by the complementary research that might be coined immoral neuroscience, the investigation of what makes us behave immorally or criminally. And this is connected to moral neuroscience, which is a subfield and a sub-theoretical framework which can be applied to many other fields in neuroscience and to science in general. So this is, again, the connection of the disconnection. How neuroscience alone can provide empirical evidence, observational one, but before we make any ethical moral judgment, we have to be extremely careful. So the right implication of a moralizing neuroscience in those areas where medicine intersects and interacts with ethics, morality, as well as advanced directives and life decisions, it's important to discuss the application of such ethical aspects as found in acute care settings. And this will be discussed in the second part of this subchapter in this part of the book. So one of the things to keep in mind is that end-of-life decisions should be made once the patient autonomy is assessed, thus determining a series of consideration, including the broader conceptual umbrella of good and evil category, particularly good life versus good death. And I will leave up to the students to review this part of the chapter, but keep in mind that the very term euthanasia assumes that etymological connection, euthanasia as good death. So who decides what goodness is in this context? And how does this goodness, quote unquote, depend from above? What is the aboveness? We will return to this term later on. And how can advanced directives reflect that? Now, conceptual issues regarding autonomy, consent, and personhood are, for instance, addressed by Coleman in 2013 when discussing yet another philosophical concept, the harm principles connected to John Stuart Mill. In fact, utilitarian principles are in place in analyzing physicians' attitudes toward clinical decisions within advanced directives. And even more so, this is connected to a delicate balance between autonomy and self-determination, which is again important from the perspective of free will. Now, to provide an example here, in connection to not just neuroscience, but to medicine and nursing, Acad mentions beneficence, justice and fidelity, self-determination and autonomy, full disclosure and veracity, informed consent and privacy and confidentiality. Please review this in the textbook, also because this is connected to Kohlberg's theory of moral development, particularly the third level for morality, from heteronomous to universal. And these considerations are connected to, yet again, philosophy and psychology. Think about Maslow, particularly in the observation by Thielke, Harris, Thompson, and Patel, that refer to being an expert and competent medical professional means, again, think of what we said about expert, experience, expertise. So being an expert means A, to be able to meet their full potential, self-actualization, B, to feel competent with strong self-esteem, self-perception, and self-worth, esteem, and finally, C, to feel psychologically and professionally supported in the system, love and belongingness. So as you can see here, even from an evolutionary perspective, what is good for us, what it makes us good in terms of mind and body, this connection is good for society as a whole.
Wonderful. So let's take a break here. We covered the first part of this conversation, which will be the one for week 13. But I decided to add the second part for week 14 as well in this video, simply because I want to make sure that all students will have enough time to prepare for the final exam, for the final paper. So the very last 2 weeks of this semester should be focused on the summary of the content that we covered so far, and also utilize the most important elements of the discussion to provide evidence and support to the claims and the analysis that you will provide in your final paper. So part one, we discussed the triple S model, the model that I discussed in regard to the self, soul, and spirit perspective. Now, in the second part of the lecture, I would like to propose a solution to the mind-body problem of consciousness. Okay, so let's see what I mean by that. The hard problem of consciousness is a problem that, as we discussed in the previous 12 weeks, has been at the center of cognitive science, neuroscience, philosophy for many, many decades, and from a theoretical perspective, and even more from a spiritual perspective for millennia. I want to have a more precise scope in this second part of the lecture, because I want to analyze the mind-body problem from the perspective of psychology of consciousness. The main reason why I want to do this is to bring everything together, but also to avoid getting lost in sheer theoretical or linguistic speculation with a lower application in practice. After all, this is a course in psychology of consciousness. And so we cannot skip very basic consideration to the nature of human beings from a social, personal, and clinical perspective. That's exactly what we're going to do in this second part of the lecture, which again, we'll cover week 13 and week 14. So let's continue.
Since I've been talking a lot, let's talk about neurolinguistics here. What does neurolinguistics study? Well, since the name involves linguistics, language, of course, structure of language, form, mutations, and changes, as well as the context at large, the history, the development, and environment as sense or meaning-creating factors on the form and the use of language. Now, to be fair, this might in itself have some ethnocentric Western empirical bias so the scientific assumption that all the processes involved in neurolinguistics have a natural origin rather than a divine revelation, which is contrary to what we said earlier as a speculative analysis from anthropological and religious standpoint regard to the birth and origin of the alphabets. Okay, so a natural in terms of matter essential origin. Okay, and whichever the case, let's leave it like that. So natural origin as opposed to supernatural, paranatural entity. Although the latter term doesn't really make sense because it's not about being above nature or outside of nature. Granted, the divine being God, it's not part of nature in itself because it's separate, it creates nature, but it can also be found in nature. So you might assume that it would not be theologically incorrect to say that neurobiology, for instance, will be accounted for, if not in a causal sense, in a very strong correlation sense toward the development of language itself. And this is connected to Broca's, Wernicke, for instance, as well as to Haken, to Alexander Luria, Edith Crowley-Traeger, many others within this assumption, the development of language from an evolutionary biology perspective. Now, whether this analysis is connected to the one of complex linguistic forms, such as indicators, sentences, psychological processes, mechanism, priming versus meaning, or the observation of neural activities as a correlational activator of semantic sequences and algorithm, the issues here is how can we quantify that scientifically speaking? How can we predict something scientifically speaking? Which is, again, the issue of how can we push what we observe to the meaning, the translation of neurological processes into psychological theories, okay? And models that can explain language in connection to our sensory apparatus, to auditory stimuli. Now, to give an example, think about the serial model by Janet Fodor and Lynn Fraser, or the unification model that was proposed by Gerard Campen and Theo Fosse. Now, this is only a basic analysis of neurolinguistics, which in itself contains a semantic analysis of meaning versus value judgments, as well as what it means to understand ourselves through language, self-knowledge. This is something that Charles Leslie Stevenson discussed in examining the cognitive use of language. So our understanding, our self-knowledge through communication with other human beings in specific context. Now, without getting too much detail here, please review the text. With the first pattern analysis focus on the two parts of ethical statements, the speaker's declaration, i.e. the declaration of the speaker's attitude, and an imperative to follow in a specular way, to mimic, to copy, and mirror it. This is extremely important in connection to mirror neurons, to what we said about empathy and pruning and development, both neural development and psychological development in general. Now, cognitive, attentive, or attentional task monitoring studies originate from the semantic analysis design. More specifically, because I want to provide some elements here, for instance, the probe verification, in which a series of sentences is analyzed by presenting the subject with a probe word following each statement. In this type of experimental study, the subject then has to identify the presence of such word in the previously administered sentence. From this perspective, this experimentation is akin to acceptability, judgment, task-based research studies, and other types of research areas, for instance, lexical decision tasks using priming studies, or research on grammatical acceptability or semantic acceptability, shared by linguistics in general, including lexicology and morphology, semantics, syntax, phonetics and phonology, pragmatics, etc., etc. Now, you might wonder, what scientific methods do we use beside the theoretical analysis here? A theoretical analysis, it's not less scientific, because the analysis of words is extremely important even in testing parameters. Think about the Big Five personality test, that it's fully semantic in its origin, the analysis of words and synonym in English language at least. So it's not to say that it's less than what we find through neuroimaging, for instance. We measure this multiple times. But if you were to ask, okay, what about technologies that are used here? Well, functional near infrared spectroscopy might be one of them. DTI, or diffusion tensor imaging, that is especially useful to track neural connections between brain areas while the task is performed. But also quantitative data in relation to reaction time. Think of the Libet experiment, the acquisition time, decision time, and ordering processing of linguistic patterns by the subject. Now, to be more specific here, if we observe with an EEG a certain pattern of neural activity following a specific task, we can identify discrete values of brain responses. On a computational level, we can calculate, we can verify in terms of specific numbers those differences. Now, the common neural responses reflecting semantic processes are the center of this investigation. So think about ELAN, N400, and P600. And just to clarify here, when we mention N400, we mean the component of a time-locked EEG signals known as event-related potentials, or ERP. It is a negative going deflection peaking about 400 millisecond post-stimulus onset. Okay, so it's part of the normal brain response to word or other stimuli, and that's why we utilize them in this context. What else? Well, there is stimulation, either direct cortical stimulation or transcranial magnetic stimulations, or observing grammar syntax anomalies in the order, disposition, and conceptual structure of words within sentences, by providing evidential relations for the N400 effect or the P600 response. Think about certain studies by Ambig, Osterhout, Kotas, Hilliard, and the further use of the knowledge gathered by these language anomalies to language acquisition, in comparison to other techniques, electrophysiological techniques, electrocorticography, etc., etc. Maybe also the observational type of studies have to do with what some researchers use, and they will use an artificial experimental structure to better investigate working memory and language processing, as well as avoiding bias originating from the subject's over-focusing on the experiment itself and stimuli. Because the distraction discount might come from multiple stimuli to release a mismatched negativity response, the MMN, or by asking the subject to engage in multiple tasks at once, as in the case of the double task experiment. Now, the use of neuroimaging techniques in this context allows for a deeper comparison between language processing and whichever neural underpinnings you find at baseline, to monitor area-specific developmental stages, but also to incorporate a broader analysis on pruning, neuroplasticity, the increase in gray and white matter. And in this context, the subtraction paradigm focuses exactly on such comparison. All right, let's talk about neuroheuristics or neuristics, these two terms that analyze the scientific information on neural activity from within, adopting a problem-solving framework including complexity, non-reducibility, deduction, induction, intuition-based debate, and abstract versus abstract philosophical speculation, particularly in relation to cognitive examination of decision-making procedures. So what does neuroheuristics do? Well, they utilize the fundamental data of neurosciences, specifically from neurobiology, to follow a bottom-up process, and again, this is a theoretical bias, to understand the structure and function of the central nervous system. So what's one of the challenges to neuroheuristics? Well, it's a very difficult task of monitoring multiple neuroanatomical areas and relate them to what happens outside, to external variables. And we mentioned double heuristics. Other terms that are important to keep in mind are the quantum physics debate, the black box theory. Okay, black box theory connected to the camera obscura, right? From which the English term camera for DSLR, for instance, came from. And the aspect of being unaware, or being, actually, let me rephrase, aware of being unaware. Okay, these quantitative and qualitative aspects that heuristic understands. So the lack of knowledge, you could say, that we perceive as human beings. And the understanding of hermeneutics as a para-reflective understanding is at the center of the debate on the interpretation of medical disorders, and is therefore a founding component not only of medicine, but also psychology and bridging fields such as medical humanities or narrative medicine. Think of the work by Maria Giulia Marini, Brian Horowitz, or Tricia Greenbaum. Furthermore, we could mention the understanding of heuristics in terms of knowing what we know and better understand our decision-making processes, so as we don't encounter mistakes. We account for mistakes. We have a predictive power so that we make ourselves more scientific. Our thinking process becomes more scientific. And the more we know, the more we educate ourselves, the better we will exist, the better we will feel, the less sick we will get eventually. And this is connected to what Plato had to say, especially for the ones of you that are enrolled in other courses I teach, specifically the one on the scientific method and complementary alternative integrative medicine. Plato actually defined illness as originating in metaphysical ignorance, right? So the connection between being sick in our mind, as in being disoriented, disordered, ignorant in our understanding or cognitive understanding, has a reflection to this lack of balance in our body. And yet again, this mind-body connection is extremely clear. Now, if there is an imbalance of cognition, imbalance of mind, an imbalance of spirit, then is an imbalance in the soul. Now, from the perspective of neuroscience, this imbalance deprives the mind soul from its virtues connected to the absolute truth, being and the divine essence. According to this Platonic perspective. Now, philosophically understood, the human soul mind is in constant motion toward becoming more rational, and yet again, mind, spirit as oriented toward rationality, toward intellect, toward understanding. So, involving awareness and consciousness. Now, according to this rationality component, rationality as in ratio, we mentioned this, and we mentioned this when we talked about Berlin and Hegel again. There is a constant battle of the soul against the influence of evil, which ultimately causes physical and psychical disorders. So, how can we find balance again? Well, we need to listen to our bodies, and here's where we find, the importance of solid scientific method, medicine, as well as meditation practices, breathing exercises. And what about our mind? What about our intellect? Well, through education, we will get physically and psychologically and spiritually healthy again. Okay, so this type of education, conducting oneself from point A to B, ex ducere, ex ducare, we could say in Latin, it's actually self-education, not in the sense that you just create education from scratch, by virtue of imagining things and not pay attention to what someone else has to teach you, or even life itself has to teach you. But it's self-education because it's the education of the self. Think about what we said about curing the soul, the cura anime, the curatus anime. What is important about neuroeconomics? Well, it's important because we're talking about our existence in the world, our behavior, and behavior in this context is interpreted from the perspective of single decision in the individual or multiple decisions, as well as a single better, worse choice among many options. So, of course, it's connected to ethics. Now, in mainstream modern neuroeconomics, the main assumptions follow the ones of contemporary economics, particularly in regard to expected utility, utility maximization, as in Bernoulli, logical base of informed and rational agent-based decision, and standardized single currency system models on overall utility values. Now, this is, of course, connected to what we said a few weeks ago regarding the materialist or utilitarianist connection between capitalism and communism, and the related criticism to mainstream economic systems. Now, a similar criticism is found in the definition of risk and avoidable or unwanted outcomes, and on whether firing rates of individual neurons can be understood under the lens of better choice or decisions to avoid. And I refer in this context to the bibliography at the end of the textbook, but particularly the studies by Padova, Schioppa, and Assad on the orbitofrontal cortex of monkeys. As animals, especially humans, make decisions in a social environment, elements of social neuroscience and psychology or sociology are used in this field to account for the amount of social factor in each decision of series or choices. Now, there are several examples here connected to morality, value, judgment. Think of the prisoner's dilemma by Flood and Drescher, where the concept of trust plays a fundamental role in that it determines the level of cooperation between individuals, among individuals, and on the level of neuroeconomics, the increased outcome in terms of spread shared benefit within social cooperation is compared with individual single gain, the gain of the individual, and it's modulated by the presence of oxytocin and the activation of the reward pathways in the central nervous system, more specifically the ventral striatum, as well as the tegmental area in the brain. And this provides, yet again, a solid neuroscientific, neurobiological, neuroanatomical, and functional perspective to understand how we function, how we reason, how we make choices as human beings. So, and how do we know this? Through neuroimaging technologies, because these studies rely on the analysis of blood oxygenation levels, as well as the presence or absence or increase, decrease of specific chemicals during activation, action, function at baseline. So you compare any activity with a control activity, or you compare average subject with subjects affected by neurocognitive damage, specifically in the case of behavioral or emotional related areas. Think about the limbic system, particularly the amygdala, and and so oxytocin in this kind plays a fundamental role. But we should also mention serotonin in relation to intertemporal choice, the expected utility assigned by human subjects to events occurring at different times, as opposed to the assumed consistency of choice found in discounted utility, the presence of dopamine as well, and increased activation of the dopamine reward pathways in the nucleus accumbens, as well as the B8 area of frontal median cortex, the frontal parietal cortex, and the medial prefrontal cortex for difficult decision-making processes involving uncertainties. And this is very, very important to verify again the difference between baseline and outliers, normal and abnormal behavior. And just to mention the work by Kahneman and Tversky, because it's mentioned throughout economics, the generalized tendency to overweight small probabilities and underweight large ones in terms of showing risk-seeking behaviors, and the neural basis for this, when the balance between sheer uncertainty and risk appears to show heaviness, on the latter, as in gaming or gambling, we notice, interestingly enough, an increased activation of the insular cortex. So these are fascinating fields, as are fascinating the other fields to which neuroeconomics connect. So psychology, think about Bandura and Michel on decision making. Think about the concept of immediate and delayed reward. Where, of course, the neural underpinnings appear to be the lateral prefrontal cortex, albeit with a ratio differential. But to be specific, what we know through research is that the limbic system is generally more activated in the case of impulsive decisions, as you probably expect, while the cortex is more activated in general aspect of intertemporal decision processes. So it's about ratio. The ratio of limbic to cortex activation decreased as a function of the amount of time passed until the reward, regardless if the reward is actually obtained or is perceived as such. And this will also explain the activation of other chemical components, particularly hormones and neurotransmitters, as well as the production of stress-related chemicals, cortisol, and the activation of stress response, which is in turn extremely important when talking about addiction in general, drug addiction more specifically. So this is a fascinating field that is part of neuroscience as a whole. Let's talk about artificial intelligence briefly, I dare to say, because I refer to the research studies presented as part of the bibliographical direction in this textbook, starting by understanding the term. So we talked about intelligence multiple times, so just a brief review here. What do we mean by artificial? Well, it comes from, as usual, the Latin artificialis or artificialis, depending if you use the current pronunciation or the archaic one, or the ecclesiastical church pronunciation, the Italian pronunciation, as opposed to the traditional pronunciation. So artificial as made with or made by or made out of art as in techne, so something that you create, so something that is artificial, so produced by human beings rather than occurring naturally. So usually this means by copying or imitating something natural. That's at least how artificial came to be in English language. So what do we mean by that? Well, we could mean things such as computer-brain interface and things that connect our knowledge of our human brain-based processes to the application of such processes in informatics, for instance. Okay, so comprehension and perception, capacity for logic, learning, planning, creativity, and problem solving. As far as human processes. Now, the main problem in identifying perception has to do with the connection with the self, so self-awareness, self-perception, and connection to what we know about human intelligence, how we can read between these lines. And so at the center of the development of artificial intelligence technologies, we find indeed pattern recognition, for instance, the ability to recognize facial expressions on one side and familiar faces on the other. This is a particular feature of human beings, as you already know. Think about prosopagnosia in this context, but also the study of communication, language understanding, speech production, concept formation, and the ability to read again between the lines. Think about the theory of multiple intelligences by Gardner. So these 8 main abilities, right, as a basis for related intelligence: the linguistic, the logical, mathematical, the spatial, the musical, the bodily, the kinesthetic, the interpersonal and intrapersonal, as well as the intelligence compensation theory, the ICT by Wood and Angard, or the investment theory based on the Kettle-Horn-Carroll theory, the LI effect or latent inhibition by Lyubov and Moore, the Pareto-frontal integration theory of intelligence, Jean Piaget talking about developmental psychology, the PASS or PASS theory of intelligence by Luria, the process personality intelligent knowledge theory, the triarchy theory of intelligence by Sternberg, and many, many, many others. In discussing sense, purpose, and meaning, the textbook does not propose a final solution of the mind-body problem, because this final has to do with either termination or end of a process, but also with some types of goal function, as well as boundary, perimeter, which really is connected to sense, purpose, and meaning, because it's about defining something, and this defining has to do with finis, right, with the boundary, the perimeter, and it's a definition that varies from individual to individual, subjectively and personally. So we could argue that there can be multiple solutions to the mind-body problems. In fact, as many solutions as there are individuals, or even more, as there are perspectives of viewpoints or traits, even personalities within each individual. But we have to figure out whether this is actually a good approach or not, because aside from the fact that there might be more than one individual, thinking about what we said about corpus callosotomy, or that there might be some transcendental elements, we mentioned this multiple times, the diabalane versus cymbalane, the diabolic component, this split black and white component, the diabolus, right, versus the symbolic possession and interpretation, right? So how to phrase this, how to understand the sense, purpose, and meaning? Well, by using a relatively relativistic view, okay, according to which there are philosophical positions and worldviews that might have certain neural underpinnings, and vice versa, neural underpinnings that presuppose philosophical positions. Now, so this is really expanding philosophy to philosophy itself, and neuroscience to neuroscience itself. So what do we mean by relatively relativistic? Well, an individual might embrace a certain stance on the mind-body problem or the hard problem of consciousness exactly because a certain state of mind in an individual's brain. Okay, so this does not mean that this state of mind is necessarily caused by the brain, but the very fact that there is a certain state of mind in a person might push, so to speak, the person to embrace this or that philosophical element. But this is also true for the vice versa perspective, that working on certain philosophical elements, which you could say have to do with working on an intellectual development, not just a cognitive development, but also a spiritual development, since we mentioned 1,000 times at this point the connection between the spirit and the intellect, the spiritual self and the rational self. So if you develop that, then your brain will change accordingly. We do know this through neuroplasticity, and think about meditation and prayer and integrate practices, and we can verify this in terms of everything we say so far about how we process information. Okay, so this could be viewed as going beyond double hermeneutics and going to a triple hermeneutics, which is necessary for the THTS, the triple S model. So triple hermeneutics for triple S model, self, soul, and spirit, THTS. Again, this connection to the sensus divinitatis, what we said about Plantinga, for instance, the relation between sin, for instance, lack of processes, and mental disorder. Now, the application of nature versus nurture, mutual influence, mind over matter versus matter over mind, would, however, not necessarily lead to the dismissal of any absolute or universal truth. Okay, so the fact that we're using this relatively relativistic perspective does not mean that we are embracing relativism in understanding mind-body connection, but it will actually lead to the realization that there are ulterior perceptual modalities, the content of which can only be understood with a different mindset, a different state of mind, ultimately a different state of consciousness. Now, is this our opinion? Of course, it's discussed that in the textbook, but it's an applied opinion to evaluate the evidence of the existence of these states, of multiple modalities of perceiving, of understanding, and ultimately of being, and of a non-physically based, matter-based form of mind, soul, and spirit. So in other words, there is more to our brain than our body alone. We are more than just our bodies as human beings. We do indeed have a soul and a spirit. Okay. Now, we're talking about opinions here, but keep in mind that opinion is connected to the Latin or Italian opinare. The term opinare indicates literally touching, reaching, and creating. So it's really empirically based in this sense. It's very scientific. We're not pushing to say that anybody's opinion is a scientific fact. Of course not. But if we are internally balanced, then our opinions will be informed by this balance. So opinion from opinare. Okay, so touching with the eye, reaching with the eye, creating with the eye. It's a Sanskrit root op, and connect to perception, to grasping, to seeing, right? Conceptualizing, right? Begreifen in German. And it's also touching with the mind, reaching with the mind, creating with the mind. Think of the Sanskrit root up this time, not op, so OP versus AP, found in opus or opera. So our perception actually is our opinion. If our perceptual modalities are intact, our senses, inner senses, intuitive senses, spiritual sense, the sensu divinitatis is intact, then our opinion will be universal, will be intact. Okay, so we should not try to eliminate our subjectivity in reaching a more objective understanding of the mind-body problem, the same way as we should not try to eliminate the place of fact in reaching a more universal healing method. So this is definitely not a postmodernist position that rejects anything absolute and absolutely everything, okay? But possibly the opposite. Some could even argue that our position toward the mind-body problem, the mind-body connection, is really traditional with a capital T, okay? That understands that subjective experience as primary pathway to reach absolute universal truth. It's finding infinite doors to an incredibly vast room beyond. And this is because we're trying to find balance within ourselves and within the world. Again, we are not of the world, we are in the world, okay? And this happens because, philosophically speaking, in terms of society, everything changes. So sometimes this position might be categorized as being on the right end of the socio-political spectrum. Sometimes it will be categorized as being on the left of the socio-cultural political spectrum. But according to a balance is by definition at the center, which is exactly at the core of our connection between mind and body. The purpose of studying it is to find this spiritual balance, we could say, because if things are not in balance, that we fall prey of the caducity, the fallacy of human nature. Okay, the decadent in the way decadent as a term is utilized outside of the English linguistic sphere, so something that is falling apart. Think about Stanley Milgram experiment, the obedience experiments, and the connection between authority and obedience to unethical, immoral, and hostile behavior, and the connection with type A and type B when we talk about personality, right? Not cluster A, B, and C of personality disorders, or personality A, B, C, and D, but type A versus type B in terms of the connection between empathy and balance as opposed to aggression and anger. Okay, now, so how do we find these ethical standards, this basis? Well, through ourselves as well as from above. Now, the connection from above is its connection to the legal aspect, the social aspects, but the fact that there has to be freedom of understanding, because anyone, talking about this lack of morality, this silent experiment, anyone can commit wrongful acts if under pressure or coercion, under perceived or real authority, or they're made to believe they're doing the right thing. And that's the issue with an imbalance, freedom from freedom itself. We might think that we might be free, but in the end, we're actually held captives, and the connection with captivus and bad was already examined in previous weeks. Okay, and there's a further connection, a connection with literary masterpieces. Think of the Banality of Evil by Arendt, or the Evil of Banality by Binich. So, or the whole discussion on quote unquote bad philosophies that Sartre and Camus, even them, warn us against, right? The bad philosophy as philosophy that promote the full abandonment of reason, rationality, or rational methods, right? Because if you find this balance, your mind and body connection will give you the best of both worlds. You will perceive in a spiritual sense, but you have a strong scientific understanding, okay? So, and even if you want to take a very simple aspects to this interpretation, Sartre and Camus, since human beings are responsible for what man is, and at the same time man is responsible for other human beings, man always chooses the better for himself, and therefore for humanity, because we come from the same core. It's a fascinating thing to keep in mind. So, where does those rules come from? What is this aboveness? Does it come from our biological perspective, or from our body, or does it come from our mind? Well, the aboveness of human ethics, knowing what we should do, can also be aboveness from a higher, more profound sphere, a sphere of light, of spirituality, right? An entity which communicates with us through us, because we as human beings are made of the same, I dare to use the term, divine light, right? So something is communicated with us through us, again, revelation, revealed to us, discovered, okay? More specifically to the complex apparatus of mind-body processes to create an experience, both objective and subjective. It's a mind-body experience, and therefore a mind-body evidence. We know it to be true because we experience it as true, and therefore it appears to us as true. We have evidence of the truth. It's an experience that has to be fully integrated, right? So, the mind-body problems provided both experience and evidence in ontological and practical terms, because we are able to connect the multiple aspects of ourselves, and everything comes together.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. This concludes part A and B of week 13 and 14, Psychology of Consciousness. As I mentioned before, this is a solution, not the solution to the mind-body problem of consciousness. I hope that you will continue your investigation on this field. And I also want to make sure that all the things we discussed this semester will be part of your analysis for the final paper. It's not a final description of how to solve the mind-body problem. It's not a final analysis of consciousness, but I hope that I provided some level of critical thinking to understand which theories make more logical sense, which clinical application are more structured in solid science, and also the importance of strong-based philosophy in understanding what we mean by consciousness and how our human psychology relates to this fascinating field. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. In the last week and a half, 2 weeks, please continue focusing on the final paper. I am here to support you in your learning, and I am very, very curious about what you're going to explore next in your final project. Thank you very much, and I will see you all next week. Bye-bye.